So now we'll dive a little bit deeper into second species counterpoint. As I mentioned in the previous video, where first species counterpoint features note against note, or one note of countermelody per note of cantus firmus, second species counterpoint doubles that ratio. So for every note of cantus firmus, we have two notes of counterpoint, or two notes of countermelody. This 2-to-1 ratio kind of helps accomplish the goal of counterpoint in that it highlights the independence of each voice, so we have some contrast in one voice that is moving by at twice the speed of the other. While the 2-to-1 ratio between the countermelody line and the cantus firmus line is a defining feature of second species counterpoint, there are a few places in any given example where we'll actually have exceptions to that ratio. One of those includes the last note of the cantus firmus, which, like in first species, will be joined by just a single note of counterpoint, forming an octave. Another possible exception is at the very beginning of a counterpoint example. During the first note of cantus firmus, you may very well have one and then a second note of the countermelody. However, you can delay the beginning of the countermelody, having a bit of a staggered entrance, having the cantus firmus sound first, and then halfway through that duration, having the first note of counterpoint. It should be noted that the first note of countermelody should still form a fifth or an octave against that first note of cantus firmus, whether the two begin at the same time or those entrances are staggered. The last possible exception concerns the penultimate or the second to last bar. Remember when we discussed the first exception, we talked about how the final note must be a single note of countermelody against the single note of cantus firmus, forming that octave we talked about in first species, with both notes sounding the first scale degree or the tonic pitch or do. And remember from first species that the note just before that in the countermelody must be the leading tone. Well, that requirement stands in second species as well. The difference is you may either sound that leading tone in the second to last bar as a single whole note, thereby creating that exception to the 2-to-1, or as two half notes like the rest of the second species. Again, if you do the two half notes, the second of those half notes must be the leading tone because it must lead directly into that first scale degree in the final bar. Aside from those exceptions, the rest of the second species example must feature that 2-to-1 ratio, with notes in the countermelody alternating between those that happen at the same time as a cantus firmus pitch change and those that happen between changes of the cantus firmus. The notes in the countermelody that coincide with changes in the cantus firmus are said to occur on strong beats, whereas those that come between cantus firmus changes are said to occur on weak beats. As we go about constructing a countermelody line, it helps to remember that many of the principles we learned in first species will apply to second species as well, especially to the strong beats. As we look at those strong beats, one of the principles we carry over from first species is that the strong beat half notes must form consonant intervals above the corresponding cantus firmus notes. That means that they are limited to fifths and octaves, those would be the perfect consonances, or sixths and thirds, which are the imperfect consonances. As with first species, we want to have a preference towards those sixths and those thirds whenever possible. When we do feature fifths or octaves on those strong beats, a few things to remember from first species include that we can't have two strong beats fifths in a row or two strong beat octaves in a row. Also, if we do have a fifth, we want to make sure that it's not a diminished fifth, which is actually a dissonant interval. We want to make sure that any fifths are perfect fifths. As for the imperfect consonances, the thirds and the sixths, we want to maintain the rule that among the strong beats, we should have no more than 3 consecutive thirds or 3 consecutive sixths. Some of the melodic principles from first species that hold here as well is that we do want to continue to feature stepwise motion when possible and be very reserved with our leaps. If we are going to leap, then leaps of a third are preferable to larger leaps. Also, the larger leap we use, the more responsibility we have to kind of fill that leap in by opposing stepwise motion immediately after the leap. And then we can't leap dissonances such as tritones, whether spelled as an augmented fourth or a diminished fifth, or a seventh of any kind. We also still want to be able to step back from our melodic line and see something that's coherent on one hand, which is to say that it all kind of hangs together and doesn't really have these big gaps that make it sound disjunct, which is one of the reasons, of course, that we want to fill in our leaps when we make them. But we also want something that has a sense of melodic flow, some melodic interest, so to speak, similarly to what we talked about with first species. So second species introduces some new possibilities with respect to first species in that we now have in the countermelody this intervening second half note or this weak beat that occurs between arrivals of pitches in the cantus firmus. When possible, we want to treat that weak beat half note with stepwise motion, especially used as a passing tone. A passing tone is a note that is approached and continued by step in the same direction. So really a passing tone separates two pitches that would be a third apart. Just as we label the intervals between the countermelody line and the cantus firmus line in first species, we'll continue to label those intervals in second species, including the intervals created between the second note or the weak beat of the melody line and the continuing note in the cantus firmus. As we do that and we use those second weak beat notes as passing tones, we will notice that they frequently create dissonant intervals against a continuing cantus firmus note. And that's actually okay under the conditions we've described here. That is that we're talking about the weak beat interval, and we're also talking about a weak beat note in the counter melody that's serving as a passing tone. In fact, these are the only conditions under which we can have a harmonic dissonance. As much as we prefer to approach that weak beat half note by step, sometimes there's really no way around leaping into that weak beat, and that's okay under a couple of conditions. First of all, if we do make a leap, we must leap into a weak beat half note that forms a consonant interval against a continuing cantus firmus pitch. Remember that dissonance we talked about only works if that note is being used as a passing tone. But if you're leaping into that weak beat half note, then the weak beat half note must form a consonant against the cantus firmus. Otherwise, if we're going to leap into that weak beat half note, we'll follow the same principles around melodic leaps that we learned from first species. So here I have an example of second species, and it's really based on the same cantus firmus, in fact, in the same transposition that I used in my first species example. Okay? So a couple of things that I want you to notice. Again, you see I've got kind of a purple thing kind of locked in at the end here. I know that I need to end at an octave, right? And I know that that octave needs to be the tonic pitch in both the cantus firmus line and in the counterpoint line, right? So I've just gone ahead and locked that in. Okay, you'll see that I've exemplified the option we have in second species of beginning with a downbeat rest in the counter melody and bringing that in just a little bit later. Okay, and notice that when I do that, I still need to begin with one of those perfect intervals. In this case, I've chosen a fifth. Remember, last time I chose an octave. Okay, now one thing I should mention, you can see that this is obviously more than an octave, right? It's an octave plus a fifth, and this just reminds us that we always use the simplified versions of the intervals. So let's go ahead and compare the intervals we have on the strong beats, or the beats that coincide with changes in both the cantus firmus line and the counter melody line. You see that I still have primarily thirds and sixths. In fact, I've got a little bit of flexibility in second species to where I really don't have to have any of those perfect intervals, octaves and fifths on the strong beats until, of course, the places where I actually need them at the beginning and end. You'll notice that the penultimate bar, I've used just a whole note. I can do that in second species in that second to last bar, and I've made sure that that note just before the end in the counter melody is in fact a leading tone that resolves upward. So now let's look at the harmonic intervals I have corresponding with the weak beats, and you'll notice as the cantus firmus holds, I've gone ahead and labeled the interval that's created with that motion in the counter melody, right? So here I've got an octave, got a seventh here, right? There's one of those dissonances that I talked about. I'll come back to that in a second. A fifth here, an octave here, fifth here, fifth, okay, fifth, seventh, octave. Okay. And you'll notice a lot of those weak beats correspond to those perfect intervals, which, remember, we tried to avoid them when they were on the strong beats. But because of kind of the metric position, because of where they are in kind of a weaker part of the meter, we don't really notice those kinds of imperfections that we hear when they arrive frequently on strong beats. So in this instance, they're actually okay. It's even okay that I have, for example, weak beats that are successive fifths. Okay, here, because again, they're on the weak part of the beat, so we don't have that same sense of ultra uniformity that we have with consecutive fifths on strong beats, so that's perfectly fine. Notice that in places where I have dissonant weak beats, where I've got the sevenths on the weak beats, I can do that only because the note in the counter melody is operating as a passing tone, right? Remember, I can use dissonances if they're on the weak beats and if the note in the counter melody is serving as a passing tone. And I've done that here because I've approached this note by step in one direction, and I continue in that same direction using another step. And that's what makes this a passing tone. There's no leap on either side of this, okay? And the motion is kind of continuous on both sides of that note. And similar situation with this seventh here, okay? In fact, it happens to be the same three notes, okay? With the B here acting as the passing tone. So this all works quite well. Just jumping back in here to talk about another weak beat dissonance I have, this one occurring with one of the weak beat fifths that I talked about just a little bit ago, but I kind of glossed over it. This is the fifth between the G sharp in the cantus firmus and this D here in the counter melody. Now, it's a fifth, but it's not a perfect fifth like I have on the weak beats of the next two bars. This is actually a diminished fifth, or a tritone, which of course is a dissonant interval. And this is an allowable dissonance again because this D is on the weak beat and because it serves as a passing tone between the E and the C sharp. So just another example of a permissible dissonance in second species. So now if I step back, I look at kind of the shape of my melodic line. Okay, and again, there's some ebb, there's some flow. It isn't kind of staying too stagnantly in one place. Okay, and it seems to work out just well. I just want to point out one more time that my penultimate interval, right, just before the octave, I have a sixth, created by the re, or the second scale degree in the cantus firmus, against the T, or the seventh scale degree in the counter melody, right? This is a feature that's always going to happen at the very end of counterpoint. So let's take a listen to this example.